Section 1 of Chapter 21 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 21, Section 1. On the Continent, the news of Mary's death excited various emotions. The Huguenots, in every part of Europe to which they had wandered, bewailed the elect lady, who had retrenched from her own royal state in order to furnish bread and shelter to the persecuted people of God. In the United Provinces, where she was well known and had always been popular, she was tenderly lamented. Matthew Prior, whose parts and accomplishments had obtained for him the patronage of the magnificent Dorset, and who was now attached to the embassy at the Hague, wrote that the coldest and most passionless of nations was touched. The very marble, he said, wept. The lamentations of Cambridge and Oxford were echoed by Leyden and Utrecht. The States General put on mourning. The bells of all the steeples of Holland tolled dolefully day after day. James, meanwhile, strictly prohibited all mourning at Saint-Germain, and prevailed on Lewis to issue a similar prohibition at Versailles. Some of the most illustrious nobles of France, and among them the Dukes of Bouillon and of Duras, were related to the House of Nassau, and had always, when death visited that house, punctiliously observed the decent ceremonial of sorrow. They were now forbidden to wear black, and they submitted, but it was beyond the power of the great King to prevent his high-bred and sharp-witted courtiers from whispering to each other that there was something pitiful in this revenge taken by the living on the dead, by a parent on a child. The hopes of James and of his companions in exile were now higher than they had been since the day of La Hogue. Indeed, the general opinion of politicians, both here and on the Continent, was that William would find it impossible to sustain himself much longer on the throne. He would not, it was said, have sustained himself so long but for the help of his wife. Her affability had conciliated many who had been repelled by his freezing looks and short answers. Her English tones, sentiments, and tastes had charmed many who were disgusted by his Dutch accent and Dutch habits. Though she did not belong to the High Church party, she loved that ritual to which she had been accustomed from infancy, and complied willingly and reverently with some ceremonies which he considered, not indeed as sinful, but as childish, and in which he could hardly bring himself to take part. While the war lasted, it would be necessary that he should pass nearly half the year out of England. Hitherto she had, when he was absent, supplied his place, and had supplied it well. Who was to supply it now? In what vicegerent could he place equal confidence? To what vicegerent would the nation look up with equal respect? All the statesmen of Europe therefore agreed in thinking that his position, difficult and dangerous at best, had been made more difficult and more dangerous by the death of the Queen. But all the statesmen of Europe were deceived, and, strange to say, his reign was decidedly more prosperous and more tranquil after the decease of Mary than during her life. A few hours after he had lost the most tender and beloved of all his friends, he was delivered from the most formidable of all his enemies. Death had been busy at Paris as well as in London. While Tennyson was praying by the bed of Mary, Bourdaloue was administering the last unction to Luxemburg. The great French general had never been a favourite at the French court, but when it was known that his feeble frame, exhausted by war and pleasure, was sinking under a dangerous disease, the value of his services was for the first time fully appreciated. The royal physicians were sent to prescribe for him. The sisters of Saint Cyr were ordered to pray for him, but prayers and prescriptions were in vain. "How glad the Prince of Orange will be," said Lewis, "when the news of our loss reaches him." He was mistaken. That news found William unable to think of any loss but his own. During the month which followed the death of Mary, the King was incapable of exertion. Even to the addresses of the two Houses of Parliament he replied only by a few inarticulate sounds. The answers which appear in the journals were not uttered by him, but were delivered in writing. Such business as could not be deferred was transacted by the intervention of Portland, who was himself oppressed with sorrow. During some weeks the important and confidential correspondence between the King and Heinsius was suspended. At length William forced himself to resume that correspondence, but his first letter was the letter of a heartbroken man. Even his martial ardour had been tamed by misery. "I tell you in confidence," he wrote, "that I feel myself to be no longer fit for military command. Yet I will try to do my duty, and I hope that God will strengthen me." So despondingly did he look forward to the most brilliant and successful of his many campaigns. There was no interruption of parliamentary business. While the Abbey was hanging with black for the funeral of the Queen, the Commons came to a vote, which at the time attracted little attention, which produced no excitement, which has been left unnoticed by voluminous annalists, and of which the history can be but imperfectly traced in the archives of Parliament, but which has done more for liberty and for civilisation than the Great Charter or the Bill of Rights. Early in the session a select committee had been appointed to ascertain what temporary statutes were about to expire, and to consider which of those statutes it might be expedient to continue. The report was made, and all the recommendations contained in that report were adopted, with one exception. Among the laws which the committee advised the House to renew was the law which subjected the press to a censorship. The question was put that the House do agree with the committee in the resolution that the Act entitled an Act for preventing abuses in printing seditious, treasonable, and unlicensed pamphlets, and for regulating of printing and printing presses, be continued. The Speaker pronounced that the Noes had it, and the Ayes did not think fit to divide. A bill for continuing all the other temporary acts, which, in the opinion of the committee, could not properly be suffered to expire, was brought in, passed, and sent to the Lords. In a short time this bill came back with an important amendment. The Lords had inserted in the list of acts to be continued the Act which placed the press under the control of licensers. The Commons resolved not to agree to the amendment, demanded a conference, and appointed a committee of managers. The leading manager was Edward Clarke, a stanch Whig who represented Taunton, the stronghold, during 50 troubled years of civil and religious freedom. Clarke delivered to the Lords in the Painted Chamber a paper containing the reasons which had determined the Lower House not to renew the Licensing Act. This paper completely vindicates the resolution to which the Commons had come, but it proves at the same time that they knew not what they were doing, what a revolution they were making, what a power they were calling into existence. They pointed out concisely, clearly, forcibly, and sometimes with a grave irony which is not unbecoming, the absurdities and iniquities of the statute which was about to expire. But all their objections will be found to relate to matters of detail. On the great question of principle, on the question whether the liberty of unlicensed printing be, on the whole, a blessing or a curse to society, not a word is said. The Licensing Act is condemned, not as a thing essentially evil, but on account of the petty grievances, the exactions, the jobs, the commercial restrictions, the domiciliary visits which were incidental to it. It is pronounced mischievous because it enables the Company of Stationers to extort money from publishers, because it empowers the agents of the government to search houses under the authority of general warrants, because it confines the foreign book trade to the port of London, because it detains valuable packages of books at the custom house till the pages are mildewed. The Commons complain that the amount of the fee which the licenser may demand is not fixed. They complain that it is made penal in an officer of the customs to open a box of books from abroad except in the presence of one of the censors of the press. How, it is very sensibly asked, is the officer to know that there are books in the box till he has opened it? Such were the arguments which did what Milton's Areopagitica had failed to do. The Lords yielded without a contest. They probably expected that some less objectionable bill for the regulation of the press would soon be sent up to them, and in fact such a bill was brought into the House of Commons, read twice, and referred to a select committee. But the session closed before the committee had reported, and English literature was emancipated, and emancipated for ever from the control of the government. This great event passed almost unnoticed. Evelyn and Luttrell did not think it worth mentioning in their diaries. The Dutch minister did not think it worth mentioning in his dispatches. No allusion to it is to be found in the monthly Mercuries. The public attention was occupied by other and far more exciting subjects. One of those subjects was the death of the most accomplished, the most enlightened, and, in spite of great faults, the most estimable of the statesmen who were formed in the corrupt and licentious Whitehall of the Restoration. About a month after the splendid obsequies of Mary, a funeral procession of almost ostentatious simplicity passed round the shrine of Edward the Confessor to the chapel of Henry the Seventh. There, at a distance of a few feet from her coffin, lies the coffin of George Savile, Marquess of Halifax. Halifax and Nottingham had long been friends, and Lord Eland, now Halifax's only son, had been affianced to the Lady Mary Finch, Nottingham's daughter. The day of the nuptials was fixed. A joyous company assembled at Burley on the Hill, the mansion of the bride's father, which, from one of the noblest terraces in the island, looks down on magnificent woods of beech and oak, on the rich valley of Catmos, and on the spire of Oakham. The father of the bridegroom was detained to London by indisposition, which was not supposed to be dangerous. On a sudden his malady took on an alarming form. He was told that he had but a few hours to live. He received the intimation with tranquil fortitude. It was proposed to send off an express to summon his son to town. But Halifax, good-natured to the last, would not disturb the felicity of the wedding day. He gave strict orders that his interment should be private, prepared himself for the great change by devotions which astonished those who had called him an atheist, and died with the serenity of a philosopher and of a Christian, while his friends and kindred, not suspecting his danger, were tasting the sack posset and drawing the curtain. His legitimate male posterity and his titles soon became extinct. No small portion, however, of his wit and eloquence descended to his daughter's son, Philip Stanhope, fourth Earl of Chesterfield. But it is perhaps not generally known that some adventurers who, without advantages of fortune or position, made themselves conspicuous by the mere force of ability, inherited the blood of Halifax. He left a natural son, Henry Carey, whose dramas once crowded audiences to the theatres, and some of whose gay and spirited verses still live in the memory of hundreds of thousands. From Henry Carey descended that Edmund Kean, who in our time transformed himself so marvellously into Shylock, Iago, and Othello. More than one historian has been charged with partiality to Halifax. The truth is that the memory of Halifax is entitled in an especial manner to the protection of history. For what distinguishes him from all other English statesmen is this, that through a long public life, and through frequent and violent revolutions of public feeling, he almost invariably took that view of the great questions of his time which history has finally adopted. He was called inconstant because the relative position in which he stood to the contending factions was perpetually varying. As well might the pole star be called inconstant because it is sometimes to the east and sometimes to the west of the pointers. To have defended the ancient and legal constitution of the realm against a seditious populace at one conjuncture, and against a tyrannical government at another, to have been the foremost defender of order in the turbulent Parliament of 1680, and the foremost defender of liberty in the servile Parliament of 1685, to have been just and merciful to Roman Catholics in the days of the Popish plot, and to exclusionists in the day of the Rye House plot, to have done all in his power to save both the head of Stafford and the head of Russell. This was a course which contemporaries, heated by passion and deluded by names and badges, might not unnaturally call fickle, but which deserves a very different name from the late justice of posterity. There is one, and only one, deep stain on the memory of this eminent man. It is melancholy to think that he, who had acted so great a part in the Convention, could have afterwards stooped to hold communication with Saint-Germain. The fact cannot be disputed, yet for him there are excuses which cannot be pleaded for others who were guilty of the same crime. He did not, like Marlborough, Russell, Godolphin, and Shrewsbury, betray a master by whom he was trusted, and with whose benefits he was loaded. It was by the ingratitude and malice of the Whigs that he was driven to take shelter for a moment among the Jacobites. It may be added that he soon repented of the error into which he had been hurried by passion, that though never reconciled to the court, he distinguished himself by his zeal for the vigorous prosecution of the war, and that his last work was a tract in which he exhorted his countrymen to remember that the public burdens, heavy as they might seem, were light when compared with the yoke of France and of Rome. About a fortnight after the death of Halifax, a fate far more cruel than death befell his old rival and enemy, the Lord President. That able, ambitious, and daring statesman was again hurled down from power. In his first fall, terrible as it was, there had been something of dignity, and he had, by availing himself with rare skill of an extraordinary crisis in public affairs, risen once more to the most elevated position among English subjects. The second ruin was indeed less violent than the first, but it was ignominious and irretrievable. The peculation and venality by which the official men of that age were in the habit of enriching themselves had excited in the public mind a feeling such as could not but vent itself sooner or later in some formidable explosion. But the gains were immediate, the day of retribution was uncertain, and the plunderers of the public were as greedy and as audacious as ever, when the vengeance, long threatened and long delayed, suddenly overtook the proudest and most powerful among them. The first mutterings of the coming storm did not at all indicate the direction which it would take, or the fury with which it would burst. An infantry regiment, which was quartered at Royston, had levied contributions on the people of that town and of the neighbourhood. The sum exacted was not large. In France or Brabant, the moderation of the demand would have been thought wonderful. But to English shopkeepers and farmers, military extortion was happily quite new and quite insupportable. A petition was sent up to the Commons. The Commons summoned the accusers, and the accused to the bar. It soon appeared that a grave offence had been committed, but that the offenders were not altogether without excuse. The public money which had been issued from the Exchequer for their pay and subsistence had been fraudulently detained by their colonel and by his agent. It was not strange that men who had arms, and who had not necessaries, should trouble themselves little about the petition of right and the declaration of right. But it was monstrous that, while the citizen was heavily taxed for the purpose of paying to the soldier the largest military stipend known in Europe, the soldier should be driven by absolute want to plunder the citizen. This was strongly set forth in a representation which the Commons laid before William. William, who had been long struggling against abuses which grievously impaired the efficiency of his army, was glad to have his hands thus strengthened. He promised ample redress, cashiered the offending colonel, gave strict orders that the troops should receive their due regularly, and established a military board for the purpose of detecting and punishing such malpractices as had taken place at Royston. But the whole administration was in such a state that it was hardly possible to track one offender without discovering 10 others. In the course of the inquiry into the conduct of the troops at Royston, it was discovered that a bribe of 200 guineas had been received by Henry Guy, Member of Parliament for Hayden and Secretary of the Treasury. Guy was instantly sent to the Tower, not without much exultation on the part of the Whigs, for he was one of those tools who had passed, together with the buildings and furniture of the public offices, from James to William. He affected the character of a high churchman, and he was known to be closely connected with some of the heads of the Tory party, and especially with Trevor. Another name, which was afterwards but too widely celebrated, first became known to the public at this time. James Craggs had begun life as a barber. He had then been a footman of the Duchess of Cleveland. His abilities, eminently vigorous, though not improved by education, had raised him in the world, and he was now entering on a career which was destined to end, after a quarter of a century of prosperity, in unutterable misery and despair. He had become an army clothier. He was examined as to his dealings with the colonels of regiments, and as he obstinately refused to produce his books, he was sent to keep Guy company in the Tower. End of section 1. Of chapter 21 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Chapter 21, Section 2. A few hours after Craggs had been thrown into prison, a committee, which had been appointed to inquire into the truth of a petition signed by some of the hackney coachmen of London, laid on the table of the House a report which excited universal disgust and indignation. It appeared that these poor hard-working men had been cruelly wronged by the Board, under the authority of which an Act of the preceding session had placed them. They had been pillaged and insulted, not only by the Commissioners, but by one Commissioner's lackey and another Commissioner's harlot. The Commons addressed the King, and the King turned the delinquents out of their places. But by this time delinquents far higher in power and rank were beginning to be uneasy. At every new detection, the excitement, both within and without the walls of Parliament, became more intense. The frightful prevalence of bribery, corruption and extortion was everywhere the subject of conversation. A contemporary pamphleteer compares the state of the political world at this conjuncture to the state of a city in which the plague has just been discovered, and in which the terrible words, "Lord, have mercy on us," are already seen on some doors. Whispers which at another time would have speedily died away and been forgotten, now swelled, first into murmurs, then into clamours. A rumour rose and spread that the funds of the two wealthiest corporations in the kingdom, the City of London and the East India Company, had largely been employed for the purpose of corrupting great men, and the names of Trevor, Seymour and Leeds were mentioned. The mention of these names produced a stir in the Whig ranks. Trevor, Seymour and Leeds were all three Tories, and had, in different ways, greater influence than perhaps any other three Tories in the kingdom. If they could all be driven at once from public life with blasted characters, the Whigs would be completely predominant both in the Parliament and in the Cabinet. Wharton was not the man to let such an opportunity escape him. At White's, no doubt, among those lads of quality who were his pupils in politics and in debauchery, he would have laughed heartily at the fury with which the nation had on a sudden begun to persecute men for doing what everybody had always done and was always trying to do. But if people would be fools, it was the business of a politician to make use of their folly. The cant of political purity was not so familiar to the lips of Wharton as blasphemy and ribaldry, but his abilities were so versatile and his impudence so consummate that he ventured to appear before the world as an austere patriot mourning over the venality and perfidy of a degenerate age. While he, animated by that fierce party spirit which in honest men would be thought a vice, but which in him was almost a virtue, was eagerly stirring up his friends to demand an inquiry into the truth of the evil reports which were in circulation, the subject was suddenly and strangely forced forward. It chanced that, while a bill of little interest was under discussion in the Commons, the postman arrived with numerous letters directed to members, and the distribution took place at the bar with a buzz of conversation which drowned the voices of the orators. Seymour, whose imperious temper always prompted him to dictate and to chide, lectured the talkers on the scandalous irregularity of their conduct, and called on the Speaker to reprimand them. An angry discussion followed, and one of the offenders was provoked into making an allusion to the stories which were current about both Seymour and the Speaker. It is undoubtedly improper to talk while a bill is under discussion, but it is much worse to take money for getting a bill passed. If we are extreme to mark a slight breach of form, how severely ought we to deal with that corruption which is eating away the very substance of our institutions? That was enough. The spark had fallen. The train was ready. The explosion was immediate and terrible. After a tumultuous debate in which the cry of the Tower was repeatedly heard, Wharton managed to carry his point. Before the House rose, a committee was appointed to examine the books of the City of London and of the East India Company. Foley was placed in the chair of the committee. Within a week he reported that the Speaker, Sir John Trevor, had, in the preceding session, received from the City 1,000 guineas for expediting a local bill. This discovery gave great satisfaction to the Whigs, who had always hated Trevor, and was not unpleasing to many of the Tories. During 6 busy sessions, his sordid rapacity had made him an object of general aversion. The legitimate emoluments of his post amounted to about 4,000 a year, but it was believed that he had made at least 10,000 a year. His profligacy and insolence united had been too much even for the angelic temper of Tillotson. It was said that the gentle Archbishop had been heard to mutter something about a knave as the Speaker passed by him. Yet, great as were the offences of this bad man, his punishment was fully proportioned to them. As soon as the report of the committee had been read, it was moved that he had been guilty of a high crime and misdemeanour. He had to stand up and to put the question. There was a loud cry of "Aye." He called on the Noes, and scarcely a voice was heard. He was forced to declare that the Ayes had it. A man of spirit would have given up the ghost with remorse and shame, and the unutterable ignominy of that moment left its mark even on the callous heart and brazen forehead of Trevor. Had he returned to the House on the following day, he would have had to put the question on a motion for his own expulsion. He therefore pleaded illness, and shut himself up in his bedroom. Wharton soon brought down a royal message authorising the Commons to elect another Speaker. The Whig chiefs wished to place Littleton in the chair, but they were unable to accomplish their object. Foley was chosen, presented, and approved. Though he had of late generally voted with the Tories, he still called himself a Whig, and was not unacceptable to many of the Whigs. He had both the abilities and the knowledge which were necessary to enable him to preside over the debates with dignity. But what, in the peculiar circumstances in which the House then found itself placed, was not unnaturally considered as his principal recommendation, was that implacable hatred of jobbery and corruption which he somewhat ostentatiously professed, and doubtless sincerely felt. On the day after he entered on his functions, his predecessor was expelled. The indiscretion of Trevor had been equal to his baseness, and his guilt had been apparent on the first inspection of the accounts of the City. The accounts of the East India Company were more obscure. The committee reported that they had sat in Leadenhall Street, had examined documents, had interrogated directors and clerks, but had been unable to arrive at the bottom of the mystery of iniquity. Some most suspicious entries had been discovered under the head of special service. The expenditure on this account had, in the year 1693, exceeded £80,000. It was proved that, as to the outlay of this money, the directors had placed implicit confidence in the Governor, Sir Thomas Cook. He had merely told them in general terms that he had been at a charge of 23,000, of 25,000, of 30,000 pounds in the matter of the Charter, and the Court had, without calling on him for any detailed explanation, thanked him for his care, and ordered warrants for these great sums to be instantly made out. It appeared that a few mutinous directors had murmured at this immense outlay, and had called for a detailed statement, but the only answer which they had been able to extract from Cook was that there were some great persons whom it was necessary to gratify. The committee also reported that they had lighted on an agreement by which the Company had covenanted to furnish a person named Colston with 200 tons of saltpetre. At the first glance, this transaction seemed merchant-like and fair, but it was soon discovered that Colston was merely an agent for Seymour. Suspicion was excited. The complicated terms of the bargain were severely examined, and were found to be framed in such a way that in every possible event Seymour must be a gainer and the Company a loser, to the extent of £10,000 or £12,000. The opinion of all who understood the matter was that the compact was merely a disguise intended to cover a bribe. But the disguise was so skilfully managed that the country gentlemen were perplexed, and that the lawyers doubted whether there were such evidence of corruption as would be held sufficient by a court of justice. Seymour escaped without even a vote of censure, and still continued to take a leading part in the debates of the Commons. But the authority which he had long exercised in the House and in the western counties of England, though not destroyed, was visibly diminished, and to the end of his life his traffic in saltpetre was a favourite theme of Whig pamphleteers and poets. The escape of Seymour only inflamed the ardour of Wharton and of Wharton's confederates. They were determined to discover what had been done with the £80,000 or £90,000 of Secret Service money which had been entrusted to Cook by the East India Company. Cook, who was member for Colchester, was questioned in his place. He refused to answer. He was sent to the Tower, and a bill was brought in providing that, if before a certain day he should not acknowledge the whole truth, he should be incapable of ever holding any office, should refund to the Company the whole of the immense sum which had been confided to him, and should pay a fine of £20,000 to the Crown. Rich as he was, these penalties would have reduced him to penury. The Commons were in such a temper that they passed the bill without a single division. Seymour, indeed, though his saltpetre contract was the talk of the whole town, came forward with unabashed forehead to plead for his accomplice. But his effrontery only injured the case which he defended. In the Upper House the bill was condemned in the strongest terms by the Duke of Leeds. Pressing his hand on his heart, he declared, on his faith, on his honour, that he had no personal interest in the question, and that he was actuated by no motive but a pure love of justice. His eloquence was powerfully seconded by the tears and lamentations of Coke, who, from the bar, implored the Peers not to subject him to a species of torture unknown to the mild laws of England. Instead of this cruel bill, he said, pass a bill of indemnity, and I will tell you all. The Lords thought his request not altogether unreasonable. After some communication with the Commons, it was determined that a joint committee of the two Houses should be appointed to inquire into the manner in which the secret service money of the East India Company had been expended, and an Act was rapidly passed providing that, if Cook would make to this committee a true and full discovery, he should be indemnified for the crimes which he might confess, and that, till he made such a discovery, he should remain in the Tower. To this arrangement Leeds gave in public all the opposition that he could with decency give. In private, those who were conscious of guilt employed numerous artifices for the purpose of averting inquiry. It was whispered that things might come out which every good Englishman would wish to hide, and that the greater part of the enormous sums which had passed through Cook's hands had been paid to Portland for His Majesty's use. But the Parliament and the nation were determined to know the truth, whoever might suffer by the disclosure. As soon as the bill of indemnity had received the royal assent, the joint committee, consisting of 12 Lords and 24 members of the House of Commons, met in the Exchequer Chamber. Wharton was placed in the chair, and in a few hours great discoveries were made. The King and Portland came out of the inquiry with unblemished honour. Not only had not the King taken any part of the secret service money dispensed by Cook, but he had not, during some years, received even the ordinary present which the Company had, in former reigns, laid annually at the foot of the throne. It appeared that not less than £50,000 had been offered to Portland and rejected. The money lay during a whole year ready to be paid to him if he should change his mind. He at length told those who pressed this immense bribe on him that if they persisted in insulting him by such an offer, they would make him an enemy of their company. Many wondered at the probity which he showed on this occasion, for he was generally thought interested and grasping. The truth seemed to be that he loved money, but that he was a man of strict integrity and honour. He took, without scruple, whatever he thought that he could honestly take, but was incapable of stooping to an act of baseness. Indeed, He resented as affronts the compliments which were paid to him on this occasion. The integrity of Nottingham could excite no surprise. £10,000 had been offered to him and had been refused. The number of cases in which bribery was fully made out was small. A large part of the sum which Cook had drawn from the Company's treasury had probably been embezzled by the brokers whom he had employed in the work of corruption, and what had become of the rest it was not easy to learn from the reluctant witnesses who were brought before the committee. One glimpse of light, however, was caught. It was followed, and it led to a discovery of the highest moment. A large sum was traced from Cook to an agent named Firebrace, and from Firebrace to another agent named Bates, who was well known to be closely connected with the High Church party and especially with Leeds. Bates was summoned, but absconded. Messengers were sent in pursuit of him. He was caught, brought into the Exchequer Chamber, and sworn. The story which he told showed that he was distracted between the fear of losing his ears and the fear of injuring his patron. He owned that he had undertaken to bribe Leeds, had been for that purpose furnished with 5,500 guineas, had offered those guineas to his Grace, and had, by his Grace's permission, left them at his Grace's house in the care of a Swiss named Robart, who was his Grace's confidential man of business. It should seem that these facts admitted of only one interpretation. Bates, however, swore that the Duke had refused to accept a farthing. Why then, it was asked, was the gold left, by his consent, at his house and in the hands of his servant? Because, answered Bates, I am bad at telling coin. I therefore begged his Grace to let me leave the pieces in order that Robart might count them for me, and his Grace was so good as to give leave. It was evident that if this strange story had been true, the guineas would, in a few hours, have been taken away. But Bates was forced to confess that they had remained half a year where he had left them. The money had indeed at last, and this was one of the most suspicious circumstances in the case, been paid back by Robart on the very morning on which the committee first met in the Exchequer Chamber. Who could believe that, if the transaction had been free from all taint of corruption, the guineas would have been detained as long as Cook was able to remain silent, and would have been refunded on the very first day on which he was under the necessity of speaking out? A few hours after the examination of Bates, Wharton reported to the Commons what had passed in the Exchequer Chamber. The indignation was general and vehement. "You now understand," said Wharton, "why obstructions have been thrown in our way at every step, why we have had to wring out truth, drop by drop, why His Majesty's name has been artfully used to prevent us from going into an inquiry which has brought nothing to light but what is to His Majesty's honour. Can we think it strange that our difficulties should have been great when we consider the power, the dexterity, the experience of him who was secretly thwarting us? It is time for us to prove signally to the world that it is impossible for any criminal to double so cunningly that we cannot track him, or to climb so high that we cannot reach him. Never was there a more flagitious instance of corruption. Never was there an offender who had less claim to indulgence. The obligations which the Duke of Leeds has to his country are of no common kind. One great debt we generously cancelled, but the manner in which our generosity has been requited forces us to remember that he was long ago impeached for receiving money from France. How can we be safe when a man proved to be venal has access to the royal ear? Our best laid enterprises have been defeated, our inmost counsels have been betrayed, and what wonder is it? Can we doubt that, together with this home trade in charters, a profitable foreign trade in secrets is carried on? Can we doubt that he who sells us to another will, for a good price, sell us all to the common enemy? Wharton concluded by moving that Leeds should be impeached of high crimes and misdemeanours. Leeds had many friends and dependents in the House of Commons, but they could say little. Wharton's motion was carried without a division, and he was ordered to go to the bar of the Lords, and there, in the name of the Commons of England, to impeach the Duke. But before this order could be obeyed, it was announced that his Grace was at the door and requested an audience. While Wharton had been making his report to the Commons, Leeds had been haranguing the Lords. He denied, with the most solemn asseverations, that he had taken any money for himself. But he acknowledged, and indeed almost boasted, that he had abetted Bates in getting money from the Company, and seemed to think that this was a service which any man in power might be reasonably expected to render to a friend. Too many persons, indeed, in that age, made a most absurd and pernicious distinction between a minister who used his influence to obtain presents for himself, and a minister who used his influence to obtain presents for his dependents. The former was corrupt, the latter was merely good-natured. Leeds proceeded to tell with great complacency a story about himself, which would, in our days, drive a public man not only out of office, but out of the society of gentlemen. When I was Treasurer in King Charles's time, my lords, the excise was to be farmed. There were several bidders. Henry Savile, for whom I had a great value, informed me they had asked for his interest with me, and begged me to tell them that he had done his best for them. "What?" said I, "tell them all so, when only one can have the farm?" "No matter," said Harry, "tell them all so, and the one who gets the farm will think that he owes it to me." The gentlemen came. I said to every one of them separately, "Sir, you are much obliged to Mr. Savile. Sir, Mr. Savile has been much your friend." In the end Harry got a handsome present, and I wished him good luck with it. I was his shadow then, I am Mr. Bates's shadow now. The Duke had hardly related this anecdote, so strikingly illustrative of the state of political morality in that generation, when it was whispered to him that a motion to impeach him had been made in the House of Commons. He hastened thither, but before he arrived the question had been put and carried. Nevertheless he pressed for admittance, and he was admitted. A chair, according to ancient usage, was placed for him within the bar, and he was informed that the House was ready to hear him. He spoke, but with less tact and judgment than usual. He magnified his own public services, but for him, he said, there would have been no House of Commons to impeach him, a boast so extravagant that it naturally made his hearers unwilling to allow him the praise which his conduct at the time of the Revolution really deserved. As to the charge against him, he said little more than that he was innocent, that there had long been a malicious design to ruin him, that he would not go into particulars, that the facts which had been proved would bear two constructions, and that of the two constructions the most favourable ought in candour to be adopted, he withdrew, after praying the House to reconsider the vote which had just been passed, or, if that could not be, to let him have speedy justice. His friends felt that his speech was no defence, and did not attempt to rescind the resolution which had been carried out just before he was heard. Wharton, with a large following, went up to the Lords and informed them that the Commons had resolved to impeach the Duke. A committee of managers was appointed to draw up the articles and to prepare the evidence. The articles were speedily drawn, but to the chain of evidence one link appeared to be wanting. That link, Robart, if he had been severely examined and confronted with other witnesses, would in all probability have been forced to supply. He was summoned to the bar of the Commons. A messenger went with the summons to the house of the Duke of Leeds, and was there informed that the Swiss was not within, that he had been 3 days absent, and that where he was the porter could not tell. The Lords immediately presented an address to the King, requesting him to give orders that the ports might be stopped and the fugitive arrested. But Robart was already in Holland, on his way to his native mountains. End of section 2. Of Chapter 21 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Chapter 21, Section 3. The flight of this man made it impossible for the Commons to proceed. They vehemently accused Leeds of having sent away the witness who alone could furnish legal proof of that which was already established by moral proof. Leeds, now at ease as to the event of the impeachment, gave himself the airs of an injured man. "My Lords," he said, "the conduct of the Commons is without precedent. They impeach me of a high crime. They promise to prove it. Then they find that they have not the means of proving it, and they revile me for not supplying them with the means. Surely they ought not to have brought a charge like this without well considering whether they had or had not evidence sufficient to support it. If Robart's testimony be, as they now say, indispensable, why did they not send for him and hear his story before they made up their minds? They may thank their own intemperance, their own precipitancy, for his disappearance. He is a foreigner. He is timid. He hears that a transaction in which he has been concerned has been pronounced by the House of Commons to be highly criminal, that his master is impeached, that his friend Bates is in prison, that his own turn is coming. He naturally takes fright. He escapes to his own country, and from what I know of him, I will venture to predict that it will be a long time before he trusts himself again within reach of the Speaker's warrant. But what is that to me? Am I to lie all my life under the stigma of an accusation like this, merely because the violence of my accusers has scared their own witness out of England? I demand an immediate trial. I move your lordships to resolve that, unless the Commons shall proceed before the end of the session, the impeachment shall be dismissed." A few friendly voices cried out, "Well moved." But the peers were generally unwilling to take a step which would have been in the highest degree offensive to the Lower House, and to the great body of those whom that House represented. The Duke's motion fell to the ground, and a few hours later the Parliament was prorogued. The impeachment was never revived. The evidence which would warrant a formal verdict of guilty was not forthcoming, and a formal verdict of guilty would hardly have answered Wharton's purpose better than the informal verdict of guilty which the whole nation had already pronounced. The work was done. The Whigs were dominant. Leeds was no longer chief minister, was indeed no longer a minister at all. William, from respect probably for the memory of the beloved wife whom he had lately lost, and to whom Leeds had shown peculiar attachment, avoided everything that could look like harshness. The fallen statesman was suffered to retain, during a considerable time, the title of Lord President, and to walk on public occasions between the Great Seal and the Privy Seal. But he was told that he would do well not to show himself at council. The business and patronage even of the department of which he was the nominal head passed into other hands, and the place which he ostensibly filled was considered in political circles as really vacant. He hastened into the country and hid himself there during some months from the public eye. When the Parliament met again, however, he emerged from his retreat. Though he was well stricken in years and cruelly tortured by disease, his ambition was still as ardent as ever. With indefatigable energy he began a third time to climb, as he flattered himself, towards that dizzy pinnacle which he had twice reached, and from which he had twice fallen. He took a prominent part in debate, but, though his eloquence and knowledge always secured him to the attention of his hearers, he was never again, even when the Tory party was in power, admitted to the smallest share in the direction of affairs. There was one great humiliation which he could not be spared. William was about to take the command of the army in the Netherlands, and it was necessary that, before he sailed, he should determine by whom the government should be administered during his absence. Hitherto Mary had acted as his vicegerent when he was out of England, but she was gone. He therefore delegated his authority to 7 Lords Justices: Tenison, Archbishop of Canterbury; Somers, Keeper of the Great Seal; Pembroke, Keeper of the Privy Seal; Devonshire, Lord Stewart; Dorset, Lord Chamberlain; Shrewsbury, Secretary of State; and Godolphin, First Commissioner of the Treasury. It is easy to judge from this list of names which way the balance of power was now leaning. Godolphin alone of the 7 was a Tory. The Lord President, still second in rank, and a few days before first in power of the great lay dignitaries of the realm, was passed over, and the omission was universally regarded as an official announcement of his disgrace. There were some who wondered that the Princess of Denmark was not appointed regent. The reconciliation, which had been begun while Mary was dying, had since her death been, in external show at least, completed. This was one of those occasions on which Sunderland was peculiarly qualified to be useful. He was admirably fitted to manage a personal negotiation, to soften resentment, to soothe wounded pride, to select, among all the objects of human desire, the very bait which was most likely to allure the mind with which he was dealing. On this occasion his task was not difficult. He had 2 excellent assistants, Marlborough in the household of Anne, and Somers in the cabinet of William. Marlborough was now as desirous to support the government as he had once been to subvert it. The death of Mary had produced a complete change in all his schemes. There was one event to which he looked forward to with the most intense longing, the accession of the Princess to the English throne. It was certain that, on the day on which she began to reign, he would be in her court all that Buckingham had been in the court of James the First. Marlborough too must have been conscious of powers of a very different order from those which Buckingham had possessed, of a genius for politics not inferior to that of Richelieu, of a genius for war not inferior to that of Turenne. Perhaps the disgraced general, in obscurity and in action, anticipated the day when his power to help and hurt in Europe would be equal to that of her mightiest princes, when he would be servilely flattered and courted by Caesar on one side and by Lewis the Great on the other, and when every year would add another £100,000 to the largest fortune that had ever been accumulated by any English subject. All this might be if Mrs. Morley were Queen, but that Mr. Freeman should ever see Mrs. Morley Queen had till lately not been very probable. Mary's life was a much better life than his, and quite as good a life as her sister's. That William would have issue seemed unlikely, but it was generally expected that he would soon die. His widow might marry again, and might leave children who would succeed her. In these circumstances Marlborough might well think that he had very little interest in maintaining that settlement of the Crown which had been made by the Convention. Nothing was so likely to serve his purpose as confusion, civil war, another revolution, another abdication, another vacancy of the throne. Perhaps the nation, incensed against William, yet not reconciled to James, and distracted between hatred of foreigners and hatred of Jesuits, might prefer both to the Dutch king and to the Popish king one who was at once a native of our country and a member of our Church. That this was the real explanation of Marlborough's dark and complicated plots was, as we have seen, firmly believed by some of the most zealous Jacobites, and is in the highest degree probable. It is certain that during several years he had spared no efforts to inflame the army and the nation against the government. But all was now changed. Mary was gone. By the Bill of Rights the crown was entailed on Anne after the death of William. The death of William could not be far distant. Indeed, all the physicians who attended him wondered that he was still alive, and, when the risks of war were added to the risks of disease, the probability seemed to be that in a few months he would be in his grave. Marlborough saw that it would now be madness to throw everything into disorder and to put everything to hazard. He had done his best to shake the throne, while it seemed unlikely that Anne would ever mount it except by violent means, but he did his best to fix it firmly. As soon as it became highly probable that she would soon be called to fill it in the regular course of nature and of law, the Princess was easily induced by the Churchills to write to the King a submissive and affectionate letter of condolence. The King, who was never much inclined to engage in a commerce of insincere compliments, and who was still in the first agonies of his grief, showed little disposition to meet her advances. But Somers, who felt that everything was at stake, went to Kensington and made his way into the royal closet. William was sitting there, so deeply sunk in melancholy that he did not seem to perceive that any person had entered the room. The Lord Keeper, after a respectful pause, broke silence, and doubtless with all that cautious delicacy which was characteristic of him, and which eminently qualified him to touch the sore places of the mind without hurting them, implored his Majesty to be reconciled to the Princess. "Do what you will," said William, "I can think of no business." Thus authorised, the mediators speedily concluded a treaty. Anne came to Kensington, and was graciously received. She was lodged in St. James's Palace. A guard of honour was again placed at her door, and the gazettes again, after a long interval, announced that foreign ministers had had the honour of being presented to her. The Churchills were again permitted to dwell under the royal roof, but William did not at first include them in the peace which he had made with their mistress. Marlborough remained excluded from military and political employment, and it was not without much difficulty that he was admitted into the circle at Kensington and permitted to kiss the royal hand. The feeling with which he was regarded by the King explains why Anne was not appointed regent. The regency of Anne would have been the regency of Marlborough, and it is not strange that a man whom it was not thought safe to entrust with any office in the state or the army should not have been entrusted with the whole government of the kingdom. Had Marlborough been of a proud and vindictive nature, he might have been provoked into raising another quarrel in the royal family, and into forming new cabals in the army. But all his passions, except ambition and avarice, were under strict regulation. He was destitute alike of the sentiment of gratitude and of the sentiment of revenge. He had conspired against the government while it was loading him with favours. He now supported it, though it requited his support with contumely. He perfectly understood his own interest. He had perfect command of his temper. He endured decorously the hardship of his present situation, and contented himself by looking forward to a reversion which would amply repay him for a few years of patience. He did not indeed cease to correspond with the court of Saint-Germains, but the correspondence gradually became more and more slack, and seems on his part to have been made up of vague professions and trifling excuses. The event which had changed all Marlborough's views had filled the minds of fiercer and more pertinacious politicians with wild hopes and atrocious projects. During the 2 years and a half which followed the execution of Grandval, no serious design had been formed against the life of William. Some hot-headed malcontents had indeed laid schemes for kidnapping or murdering him, but those schemes were not, while his wife lived, countenanced by her father. James did not feel, and, to do him justice, was not such a hypocrite as to pretend to feel any scruple about removing his enemies by those means which he had justly thought base and wicked when employed by his enemies against himself. If any such scruple had arisen in his mind, there was no want under his roof of casuists willing and competent to soothe his conscience with sophisms such as had corrupted the far nobler natures of Anthony Babington and Everard Digby. To question the lawfulness of assassination in cases where assassination might promote the interests of the Church was to question the authority of the most illustrious Jesuits, of Bellarmine and Suarez, of Molina and Mariana. Nay, it was to rebel against the chair of Saint Peter. One pope had walked in procession at the head of his cardinals, had proclaimed a jubilee, had ordered the guns of Saint Angelo to be fired in honour of the perfidious butchery in which Coligny had perished. Another pope had in a solemn allocution hymned the murder of Henry III of France in rapturous language borrowed from the ode of the prophet Habakkuk, and had extolled the murderer above Phinehas and Judith. William was regarded at Saint-Germain as a monster compared with whom Coligny and Henry III were saints. Nevertheless, James, during some years, refused to sanction any attempt on his nephew's person. The reasons which he assigned for his refusal have come down to us, as he wrote them with his own hand. He did not affect to think that assassination was a sin which ought to be held in horror by a Christian, or a villain unworthy of a gentleman. He merely said that the difficulties were great, and that he would not push his friends on extreme danger when it would not be in his power to second them effectually. In truth, while Mary lived, it might well be doubted whether the murder of her husband would really be a service to the Jacobite cause. By his death the government would lose indeed the strength derived from his eminent personal qualities, but would at the same time be relieved from the load of his personal unpopularity. His whole power would at once devolve on his widow, and the nation would probably rally round her with enthusiasm. If her political abilities were not equal to his, she had not his repulsive manners, his foreign pronunciation, his partiality for everything Dutch and for everything Calvinistic. Many who had thought her culpably wanting in filial piety would be of opinion that now at least she was absolved from all duty to a father stained with the blood of her husband. The whole machinery of the administration would continue to work without that interruption which ordinarily followed a demise of the crown. There would be no dissolution of the Parliament, no suspension of the customs and excise. Commissions would retain their force, and all that James would have gained by the fall of his enemy would have been a barren revenge. The death of the Queen changed everything. If a dagger or a bullet should now reach the heart of William, it was probable that there would instantly be general anarchy. The Parliament and the Privy Council would cease to exist. The authority of ministers and judges would expire with him from whom it was derived. It might seem not improbable that at such a moment a restoration might be effected without a blow. Scarcely, therefore, had Mary been laid in the grave when restless and unprincipled men began to plot in earnest against the life of William. Foremost among these men in parts, in courage and in energy, was Robert Charnock. He had been liberally educated, and had, in the late reign, been a Fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford. Alone in that great society he had betrayed the common cause, had consented to be the tool of the High Commission, had publicly apostatized from the Church of England, and while his college was a Popish seminary, had held the office of Vice-President. The Revolution came and altered at once the whole course of his life. Driven from the quiet cloister and from the old grove of oaks on the bank of the Cherwell, he sought haunts of a very different kind. During several years he led the perilous and agitated life of a conspirator, passed and repassed on secret errands between England and France, changed his lodgings in London often, and was known at different coffeehouses by different names. His services had been requited with a captain's commission signed by the banished king. With Charnock was closely connected George Porter, an adventurer who called himself a Roman Catholic and a Royalist, but who was in truth destitute of all religious and of all political principle. Porter's friends could not deny that he was a rake and a coxcomb, that he drank, that he swore, that he told extravagant lies about his amours, and that he had been convicted of manslaughter for a stab given in a brawl at the playhouse. His enemies affirmed that he was addicted to nauseous and horrible kinds of debauchery, and that he procured the means of indulging his infamous tastes by cheating and marauding, that he was one of a gang of clippers, that he sometimes got on horseback late in the evening and stole out in disguise, and that, when he returned from these mysterious excursions, his appearance justified the suspicion that he had been doing business on Hounslow Heath or Finchley Common. Cardell Goodman, popularly called Scum Goodman, a knave more abandoned, if possible, than Porter, was in the plot. Goodman had been on the stage, had been kept, like some much greater men, by the Duchess of Cleveland, had been taken into her house, had been loaded by her with gifts, and had requited her by bribing an Italian quack to poison 2 of her children. As the poison had not been administered, Goodman could be prosecuted only for a misdemeanour. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to a ruinous fine. He had since distinguished himself as one of the first forgers of banknotes. Sir William Parkyns, a wealthy knight bred to the law, who had been conspicuous among the Tories in the days of the Exclusion Bill, was one of the most important members of the Confederacy. He bore a much fairer character than most of his accomplices, but in one respect he was more culpable than any of them, for he had, in order to retain a lucrative office which he held in the Court of Chancery, sworn allegiance to the prince against whose life he now conspired. The design was imparted to Sir John Fenwick, celebrated on account of the cowardly insult which he had offered to the deceased Queen. Fenwick, if his own assertion is to be trusted, was willing to join in an insurrection, but recoiled from the thought of assassination, and showed so much of what was in his mind as sufficed to make him an object of suspicion to his less scrupulous associates. He kept their secret, however, as strictly as if he had wished them success. It should seem that, at first, a natural feeling restrained the conspirators from calling their design by the proper name. Even in their private consultations, they did not as yet talk of killing the Prince of Orange. They would try to seize him and carry him alive into France. If there were any resistance, they might be forced to use their swords and pistols, and nobody could be answerable for what a thrust or a shot might do. In the spring of 1695, the scheme of assassination, thus thinly veiled, was communicated to James, and his sanction was earnestly requested. But week followed week, and no answer arrived from him. he doubtless remained silent in the hope that his adherents would, after a short delay, venture to act on their own responsibility, and that he might thus have the advantage without the scandal of their crime. They seem indeed to have so understood him. He had not, they said, authorized the attempt, but he had not prohibited it, and, apprised as he was of their plan, the absence of prohibition was a sufficient warrant. They therefore determined to strike. But before they could make the necessary arrangements, William set out for Flanders, and the plot against his life was necessarily suspended till his return. End of section 3. Of chapter 21 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, chapter 21, section 4. It was on the 12th of May that the King left Kensington for Gravesend, where he proposed to embark for the Continent. 3 days before his departure, the Parliament of Scotland had, after a recess of about 2 years, met again at Edinburgh. Hamilton, who had, in the preceding session, sat on the throne and held the sceptre, was dead, and it was necessary to find a new Lord High Commissioner. The person selected was John Hay, Marquess of Tweedale, Chancellor of the realm, a man grown old in business, well informed, prudent, humane, blameless in private life, and on the whole as respectable as any Scottish lord who had been long and deeply concerned in the politics of those troubled times. His task was not without difficulty. It was indeed well known that the Estates were generally inclined to support the government, but it was also well known that there was one subject which would require the most dexterous and delicate management. The cry of the blood shed more than 3 years before in Glencoe had at length made itself heard. Towards the close of the year 1693, the reports which had at first been contemptuously derided as factious calumnies began to be generally thought deserving of serious attention. Many people, little disposed to place confidence in anything that came forth from the secret presses of the Jacobites, owned that for the honour of the government some inquiry ought to be instituted. The amiable Mary had been much shocked by what she heard. William had, at her request, empowered the Duke of Hamilton and several other Scotchmen of note to investigate the whole matter, but the Duke died, his colleagues were slack in the performance of their duty, and the King, who knew little and cared little about Scotland, forgot to urge them. It now appeared that the government would have done wisely as well as rightly by anticipating the wishes of the country. The horrible story, repeated by the non-jurors pertinaciously, confidently, and with so many circumstances as almost enforced belief, had at length roused all Scotland. The sensibility of a people eminently patriotic was galled by the taunts of southern pamphleteers, who asked whether there was on the north of the Tweed no law, no justice, no humanity, no spirit to demand redress, even for the foulest wrongs. Each of the two extreme parties, which were diametrically opposed to each other in general politics, was impelled by a peculiar feeling to call for inquiry. The Jacobites were delighted by the prospect of being able to make out a case which would bring discredit on the usurper, and which might be set off against the many offences imputed by the Whigs to Claverhouse and Mackenzie. The zealous Presbyterians were not less delighted at the prospect of being able to ruin the Master of Stair. They had never forgotten or forgiven the service which he had rendered to the House of Stuart in the time of the persecution. They knew that, though he had cordially concurred in the political revolution which had freed them from the hated dynasty, he had seen with displeasure that ecclesiastical revolution which was, in their view, even more important. They knew that church government was with him merely an affair of state, and that, looking at it as an affair of state, he preferred the episcopal to the synodical model. They could not, without uneasiness, see so adroit and eloquent an enemy of pure religion, constantly attending the royal steps, and constantly breathing counsel in the royal ear. They were therefore impatient for an investigation which, if one half of what was rumoured were true, must produce revelations fatal to the power and fame of the minister whom they distrusted. Nor could that minister rely on the cordial support of all who held office under the crown. His genius and influence had excited the jealousy of many less successful courtiers, and especially of his fellow secretary Johnstone. Thus, on the eve of the meeting of the Scottish Parliament, Glencoe was in the mouths of all Scotchmen, of all factions, and of all sects. William, who was just about to start for the Continent, learned that on this subject the Estates must have their way, and that the best thing that he could do would be to put himself at the head of a movement which it was impossible for him to resist. A commission authorising Tweedale and several other Privy Councillors to examine fully into the matter about which the public mind was so strongly excited was signed by the King at Kensington, was sent down to Edinburgh, and was there sealed with the Great Seal of the realm. This was accomplished just in time. The Parliament had scarcely entered on business when a member rose to move for an inquiry into the circumstances of the slaughter of Glencoe. Tweedale was able to inform the Estates that His Majesty's goodness had prevented their desires, that a commission of precognition had, a few hours before, passed in all the forms, and that the lords and gentlemen named in that instrument would hold their first meeting before night. The Parliament unanimously voted thanks to the King for this instance of his paternal care. But some of those who joined in the vote of thanks expressed a very natural apprehension that the second investigation might end as unsatisfactorily as the first investigation had ended. The honour of the country, they said, was at stake, and the Commissioners were bound to proceed with such diligence that the result of the inquest might be known before the end of the session. Tweedale gave assurances which for a time silenced the murmurers. But, when 3 weeks had passed away, many members became mutinous and suspicious. On the 14th of June, it was moved that the Commissioners should be ordered to report. The motion was not carried, but it was renewed day after day. In 3 successive sittings, Tweedale was able to restrain the eagerness of the assembly, but when he at length announced that the report had been completed, and added that it would not be laid before the Estates till it had been submitted to the King, there was a violent outcry. The public curiosity was intense, for the examination had been conducted with closed doors, and both commissions and clerks had been sworn to secrecy. The King was in the Netherlands. Weeks must elapse before his pleasure could be taken, and the session could not last much longer. In a fourth debate there were signs which convinced the Lord High Commissioner that it was expedient to yield, and the report was produced. It is a paper highly creditable to those who framed it, an excellent digest of evidence, clear, passionless, and austerely just. No source from which valuable information was likely to be derived had been neglected. Glengarry and Keppoch, though notoriously disaffected to the government, had been permitted to conduct the case on behalf of their unhappy kinsman. Several of the Macdonalds who had escaped from the havoc of that night had been examined, and among them the reigning Mac Ian, the eldest son of the murdered chief. The correspondence of the Master of Stair with the military men who commanded in the Highlands had been subjected to a strict but not unfair scrutiny. The conclusion to which the Commissioners came, and in which every intelligent and candid inquirer will concur, was that the slaughter of Glencoe was a barbarous murder, and that of this barbarous murder the letters of the Master of Stair were the sole warrant and cause. That Breadalbane was an accomplice in the crime was not proved, but he did not come off quite clear. In the course of the investigation it was incidentally discovered that he had, while distributing the money of William among the Highland chiefs, professed to them the warmest zeal for the interest of James, and advised them to take what they could get from the usurper, but to be constantly on the watch for a favourable opportunity of bringing back the rightful king. Breadalbane's defence was that he was a greater villain than his accusers imagined, and that he had pretended to be a Jacobite only in order to get at the bottom of the Jacobite plans. In truth, the depths of this man's knavery were unfathomable. It was impossible to say which of his treasons were, to borrow the Italian classification, single treasons, and which double treasons. On this occasion the Parliament supposed him to have been guilty only of a single treason, and sent him to the Castle of Edinburgh. The government, on full consideration, gave credit to his assertion that he had been guilty of a double treason, and let him out again. The report of the Commission was taken into immediate consideration by the Estates. They resolved, without one dissentient voice, that the order signed by William did not authorise the slaughter of Glencoe. They next resolved, but it should be seen not unanimously, that the slaughter was a murder. They proceeded to pass several votes, the sense of which was finally summed up in an address to the King. How that part of the address which related to the Master of Stair should be framed was a question about which there was much debate. Several of his letters were called for and read, and several amendments were put to the vote. It should seem that the Jacobites and the extreme Presbyterians were, but with too good cause, on the side of severity. The majority, under the skilful management of the Lord High Commissioner, acquiesced in words which made it impossible for the guilty minister to retain his office, but which did not impute to him such criminality as would have affected his life or his estate. They censured him, but censured him in terms far too soft. They blamed his immoderate zeal against the unfortunate clan, and his warm directions about performing the execution by surprise. His excess in his letters they pronounced to have been the original cause of the massacre, but, instead of demanding that he should be brought to trial as a murderer, they declared that, in consideration of his absence and of his great place, they left it to the royal wisdom to deal with him in such a manner as might vindicate the honour of the government. The indulgence which was shown to the principal offender was not extended to his subordinates. Hamilton, who had fled and had been vainly cited by proclamation at the City Cross to appear before the Estates, was pronounced not to be clear of the blood of the Glencoe men. Glenlyon, Captain Drummond, Lieutenant Lindsay, Ensign Lundy, and Sergeant Barber were still more distinctly designated as murderers, and the King was requested to command the Lord Advocate to prosecute them. The Parliament of Scotland was undoubtedly on this occasion severe in the wrong place and lenient in the wrong place. The cruelty and baseness of Glenlyon and his comrades excite, even after the lapse of 160 years, emotions which make it difficult to reason calmly. Yet whoever can bring himself to look at the conduct of these men with judicial impartiality will probably be of the opinion that they could not, without great detriment to the Commonwealth, have been treated as assassins. They had slain nobody whom they had not been positively directed by their commanding officer to slay. That subordination, without which an army is the worst of all rabbles, would be at an end if every soldier were to be held answerable for the justice of every order in obedience to which he pulls his trigger. The case of Glencoe was doubtless an extreme case, but it cannot easily be distinguished in principle from cases which, in war, are of ordinary occurrence. Very terrible military executions are sometimes indispensable. Humanity itself may require them. Who, then, is to decide whether there be an emergency such as makes severity the truest mercy? Who is to determine whether it be or be not necessary to lay a thriving town in ashes, to decimate a large body of mutineers, to shoot a whole gang of banditti? Is the responsibility with the commanding officer, or with the rank and file whom he orders to make ready, present, and fire? And if the general rule be that the responsibility is with the commanding officer, and not with those who obey him, is it possible to find any reason for pronouncing the case of Glencoe an exception to that rule? It is remarkable that no member of the Scottish Parliament proposed that any of the private men of Argyle's regiment should be prosecuted for murder. Absolute impunity was granted to everybody below the rank of sergeant. Yet on what principle? Surely, if military obedience was not a valid plea, every man who shot a Macdonald on that horrible night was a murderer; and if military obedience was a valid plea for the musketeer who acted by the order of Sergeant Barber, why not for Barber who acted by order of Glenlyon? And why not for Glenlyon who acted by order of Hamilton? It can scarcely be maintained that more deference is due from a private to a non-commissioned officer than from a non-commissioned officer to his captain, or from a captain to his colonel. It may be said that the orders given to Glenlyon were of so peculiar a nature that, if he had been a man of virtue, he would have thrown up his commission, would have braved the displeasure of Colonel, General, and Secretary of State, would have incurred the heaviest penalty which a court-martial could inflict, rather than have performed the part assigned to him. And this is perfectly true. But the question is not whether he acted like a virtuous man, but whether he did that for which he could, without infringing a rule essential to the discipline of camps and to the security of nations, be hanged as a murderer. In this case, disobedience was assuredly a moral duty, but it does not follow that obedience was a legal crime. It seems, therefore, that the guilt of Glenlyon and his fellows was not within the scope of the penal law. The only punishment which could properly be inflicted on them was that which made Cain cry out that it was greater than he could bear, to be vagabonds on the face of the earth, and to carry wherever they went a mark from which even bad men should turn away sick with horror. It was not so with the Master of Stair. He had been solemnly pronounced, both by the Commission of Precognition and by the Estates of the Realm in full Parliament, to be the original author of the massacre. That it was not advisable to make examples of his tools was the strongest reason for making an example of him. Every argument which can be urged against punishing the soldier who executes the unjust and inhuman orders of his superior is an argument for punishing with the utmost rigour of the law the superior who gives unjust and inhuman orders. Where there can be no responsibility below, there should be double responsibility above. What the Parliament of Scotland ought with one voice to have demanded was not that a poor illiterate sergeant, who was hardly more accountable than his own halbert for the bloody work which he had done, should be hanged in the Grassmarket, but that the real murderer, the most politic, the most eloquent, the most powerful of Scottish statesmen, should be brought to a public trial and should, if found guilty, die the death of a felon. Nothing less than such a sacrifice could expiate such a crime. Unhappily, the Estates, by extenuating the guilt of the chief offender, and at the same time demanding that his humble agents should be treated with a severity beyond the law, made the stain which the massacre had left on the honour of the nation broader and deeper than before. Nor is it possible to acquit the King of a great breach of duty. It is indeed highly probable that, till he received the report of his commissioners, he had been very imperfectly informed as to the circumstances of the slaughter. We can hardly suppose that he was much in the habit of reading Jacobite pamphlets, and if he did read them, he would have found in them such a quantity of absurd and rancorous invective against himself that he would have been very little inclined to credit any imputation which they might throw on his servants. He would have seen himself accused in one tract of being a concealed Papist, in another of having poisoned Jeffreys in the Tower, in a third of having contrived to have Talmash taken off at Brest. He would have seen it asserted that in Ireland he once ordered 50 of his wounded English soldiers to be burned alive. He would have seen that the unalterable affection which he felt from his boyhood to his death for 3 or 4 of the bravest and most trusty friends that ever prince had the happiness to possess was made a ground for imputing to him abominations as foul as those which are buried under the waters of the Dead Sea. He might therefore naturally be slow to believe frightful imputations thrown by writers whom he knew to be habitual liars on a statesman whose abilities he valued highly, and to whose exertions he had, on some great occasions, owed much. But he could not, after he had read the documents transmitted to him from Edinburgh by Tweedale, entertain the slightest doubt of the guilt of the Master of Stair. To visit that guilt with exemplary punishment was the sacred duty of a sovereign who had sworn, with his hand lifted up towards heaven, that he would, in his kingdom of Scotland, repress in all estates and degrees all oppression, and would do justice without acceptance of persons, as he hoped for mercy from the Father of all mercies. William contented himself with dismissing the master from office. For this great fault, a fault amounting to a crime, Burnet tried to frame, not a defence, but an excuse. He would have us believe that the King, alarmed by finding how many persons had borne a part in the slaughter of Glencoe, thought it better to grant a general amnesty than to punish one massacre by another. But this representation is the very reverse of the truth. Numerous instruments had doubtless been employed in the work of death, but they had all received their impulse, directly or indirectly, from a single mind. High above the crowd of offenders towered one offender, preeminent in parts, knowledge, rank and power. In return for many victims immolated by treachery, only one victim was demanded by justice, and it must ever be considered as a blemish on the fame of William that the demand was refused. On the 17th of July, the session of the Parliament of Scotland closed. The Estates had liberally voted such a supply as the poor country which they represented could afford. They had indeed been put into high good humour by the notion that they had found out a way of speedily making that poor country rich. Their attention had been divided between the inquiry into the slaughter of Glencoe and some specious commercial projects, of which the nature will be explained and the fate related in a future chapter. End of section 4. Chapter 21 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Chapter 21, Section 5. Meanwhile, all Europe was looking anxiously towards the Low Countries. The great warrior who had been victorious at Fleurus, at Steinkirk, and at Landen had not left his equal behind him. But France still possessed marshals well qualified for high command. Already Catinat and Boufflers had given proofs of skill, of resolution, and of zeal for the interests of the state. Either of those distinguished officers would have been a successor worthy of Luxembourg and an antagonist worthy of William. But their master, unfortunately for himself, preferred to both the Duke of Villeroy. The new general had been Lewis's playmate when they were both children, had then become a favourite, and had never ceased to be so. In those superficial graces for which the French aristocracy was then renowned throughout Europe, Villeroy was preeminent among the French aristocracy. His stature was tall, his countenance handsome, his manners nobly and somewhat haughtily polite, his dress, his furniture, his equipages, his table magnificent. No man told a story with more vivacity. No man sat his horse better in a hunting party. No man made love with more success. No man staked and lost heaps of gold with more agreeable unconcern. No man was more intimately acquainted with the adventures, the attachments, the enmities of the lords and ladies who daily filled the halls of Versailles. There were two characters especially which this fine gentleman had studied during many years, and of which he knew all the plats and windings, the character of the king, and the character of her who was queen in everything but name. But here ended Villeroy's acquirements. He was profoundly ignorant both of books and of business. At the council board he never opened his mouth without exposing himself. For war he had not a single qualification, except that personal courage which was common to him with the whole class of which he was a member. At every great crisis of his political and of his military life, he was alternately drunk with arrogance and sunk in dejection. Just before he took a momentous step, his self-confidence was boundless. He would listen to no suggestion. He would not admit into his mind the thought that failure was possible. On the first check, he gave up everything for lost, became incapable of directing, and ran up and down in helpless despair. Lewis, however, loved him, and he, to do him justice, loved Lewis. The kindness of the master was proof against all the disasters which were brought on his kingdom by the rashness and weakness of the servant, and the gratitude of the servant was honourably, though not judiciously, manifested on more than one occasion after the death of the master. Such was the general to whom the direction of the campaign in the Netherlands was confided. The Duke of Maine was sent to learn the art of war under this preceptor. Maine, the natural son of Lewis by the Duchess of Montespan, had been brought up from childhood by Madame de Maintenon, and was loved by Lewis with the love of a father, by Madame de Maintenon with the not less tender love of a foster mother. Grave men were scandalized by the ostentatious manner in which the king, while making a high profession of piety, exhibited his partiality for this offspring of a double adultery. Kindness, they said, was doubtless due from a parent to a child, but decency was also due from a sovereign to his people. In spite of these murmurs, the youth had been publicly acknowledged, loaded with wealth and dignities, created a duke and peer, placed by an extraordinary act of royal power above dukes and peers of older creation, married to a princess of the blood royal, and appointed Grand Master of the artillery of the realm. With abilities and courage, he might have played a great part in the world. But his intellect was small, his nerves were weak, and the women and priests who had educated him had effectually assisted nature. He was orthodox in belief, correct in morals, insinuating in address, a hypocrite, a mischief-maker, and a coward. It was expected at Versailles that Flanders would, during this year, be the chief theatre of war. Here, therefore, a great army was collected. Strong lines were formed from the Lys to the Scheld, and Villeroy fixed his headquarters near Tournay. Boufflers, with about 12,000 men, guarded the banks of the Sambre. On the other side, the British and Dutch troops, who were under William's immediate command, mustered in the neighbourhood of Ghent. The Elector of Bavaria, at the head of a great force, lay near Brussels. A smaller army, consisting chiefly of Brandenburgers, was encamped not far from Huy. Early in June, military operations commenced. The first movements of William were mere feints intended to prevent the French generals from suspecting his real purpose. He had his heart set on retaking Namur. The loss of Namur had been the most mortifying of all the disasters of a disastrous war. The importance of Namur, in a military point of view, had always been great, and had become greater than ever during the 3 years which had elapsed since the last siege. New works, the masterpieces of Vauban, had been added to the old defences which had been constructed with the utmost skill of Cohorn. So ably had the two illustrious engineers vied with each other and cooperated with nature, that the fortress was esteemed the strongest in Europe. Over one gate had been placed a vaunting inscription which defied the allies to wrench the prize from the grasp of France. William kept his own counsel so well that not a hint of his intention got abroad. Some thought that Dunkirk, some that Ypres was his object. The marches and skirmishes by which he disguised his design were compared by Saint Simon to the moves of a skilful chess player. Ficquer, much more deeply versed in military science than Saint Simon, informs us that some of these moves were hazardous, and that such a game could not have been safely played against Luxembourg. And this is probably true, but Luxembourg was gone, and what Luxembourg had been to William, William now was to Villeroy. While the King was thus employed, the Jacobites at home, being unable in his absence to prosecute their design against his person, contented themselves with plotting against his government. They were somewhat less closely watched than during the preceding year, for the event of the trials at Manchester had discouraged Aaron Smith and his agents. Trenchard, whose vigilance and severity had made him an object of terror and hatred, was no more, and had been succeeded in what may be called the subordinate secretaryship of state by Sir William Trumball, a learned civilian and an experienced diplomatist, of moderate opinions, and of temper cautious to timidity. The malcontents were emboldened by the lenity of the administration. William had scarcely sailed for the Continent when they held a great meeting at one of their favourite haunts, the old King's Head in Leadenhall Street. Charnock, Porter, Goodman, Parkins and Fenwick were present. The Earl of Aylesbury was there, a man whose attachment to the exiled house was notorious, but who always denied that he had ever thought of effecting a restoration by immoral means. His denial would be entitled to more credit if he had not, by taking the oaths to the government against which he was constantly intriguing, forfeited the right to be considered as a man of conscience and honour. In the assembly was Sir John Friend, a nonjuror, who had indeed a very slender wit, but who had made a very large fortune by brewing, and who spent it freely in sedition. After dinner, for the plans of the Jacobites were generally laid over wine, and generally bore some traces of the conviviality in which they had originated, it was resolved that the time was come for an insurrection and a French invasion, and that a special messenger should carry the sense of the meeting to Saint-Germain. Charnock was selected. He undertook the commission, crossed the Channel, saw James, and had interviews with the ministers of Lewis, but could arrange nothing. The English malcontents would not stir till 10,000 French troops were in the island, and 10,000 French troops could not, without great risk, be withdrawn from the army which was contending against William in the Low Countries. When Charnock returned to report that his embassy had been unsuccessful, he found some of his confederates in gaol. They had, during his absence, amused themselves after their fashion by trying to raise a riot in London on the 10th of June, the birthday of the unfortunate Prince of Wales. They met at a tavern in Drury Lane, and when hot with wine sallied forth, sword in hand, headed by Porter and Goodman, beat kettledrums, unfurled banners, and began to light bonfires. But the watch, supported by the populace, was too strong for the revellers. They were put to rout. The tavern where they had feasted was sacked by the mob. The ringleaders were apprehended, tried, fined and imprisoned, but regained their liberty in time to bear a part in a far more criminal design. By this time all was ready for the execution of the plan which William had formed. That plan had been communicated to the other chiefs of the allied forces, and had been warmly approved. Vaudemont was left in Flanders with a considerable force to watch Villeroy. The King, with the rest of his army, marched straight on Namur. At the same moment the Elector of Bavaria advanced toward the same point on one side, and the Brandenburgers on another. So well had these movements been concerted, and so rapidly were they performed, that the skilful and energetic Boufflers had but just time to throw himself into the fortress. He was accompanied by 7 regiments of dragoons, by a strong body of gunners, sappers and miners, and by an officer named Magrigny, who was esteemed the best engineer in the French service, with the exception of Vauban. A few hours after Boufflers had entered the place, the besieging forces closed round it on every side, and the lines of circumvallation were rapidly formed. The news excited no alarm at the French court. There it was not doubted that William would soon be compelled to abandon his enterprise with grievous loss and ignominy. The town was strong. The castle was believed to be impregnable. The magazines were filled with provisions and ammunition sufficient to last till the time at which the armies of that age were expected to retire into winter quarters. The garrison consisted of 16,000 of the best troops in the world. They were commanded by an excellent general. He was assisted by an excellent engineer. Nor was it doubted that Villeroy would march with his great army to the assistance of Boufflers, and that the besiegers would then be in much more danger than the besieged. These hopes were kept up by the despatches of Villeroy. He proposed, he said, first to annihilate the army of Vaudemont, and then to drive William from Namur. Vaudemont might try to avoid an action, but he could not escape. The Marshal went so far as to promise his master news of a complete victory within 24 hours. Lewis passed a whole day in impatient expectation. At last, instead of an officer of high rank loaded with English and Dutch standards, arrived a courier bringing news that Vaudemont had effected a retreat with scarcely any loss, and was safe under the walls of Ghent. William extolled the generalship of his lieutenant in the warmest terms. "My cousin," he wrote, "you have shown yourself a greater master of your art than if you had won a pitched battle." In the French camp, however, and at the French court, it was universally held that Vaudemont had been saved less by his own skill than by the misconduct of those to whom he was opposed. Some threw the whole blame on Villeroy, and Villeroy made no attempt to vindicate himself. But it was generally believed that he might, at least to a great extent, have vindicated himself had he not preferred royal favour to military renown. His plan, it was said, might have succeeded had not the execution been entrusted to the Duke of Maine. At the first glimpse of danger, the bastard's heart had died within him. He had not been able to concede his poltroonery. He had stood trembling, stuttering, calling for his confessor, while the old officers round him, with tears in their eyes, urged him to advance. During a short time the disgrace of the son was concealed from the father, but the silence of Villeroy showed that there was a secret. The pleasantries of the Dutch gazettes soon elucidated the mystery, and Lewis learned, if not the whole truth, yet enough to make him miserable. Never during his long reign had he been so moved. During some hours his gloomy irritability kept his servants, his courtiers, even his priests, in terror. He so far forgot the grace and dignity for which he was renowned throughout the world, that in the sight of all the splendid crowd of gentlemen and ladies who came to see him dine at Marly, he broke a cane on the shoulders of a lackey and pursued the poor man with the handle. The siege of Namur, meanwhile, was vigorously pressed by the allies. The scientific part of their operations was under the direction of Cohorn, who was spurred by emulation to extend his utmost skill. He had suffered, 3 years before, the mortification of seeing the town, as he had fortified it, taken by his great master Vauban. To retake it, now that the fortifications had received Vauban's last improvements, would be a noble revenge. On the 2nd of July the trenches were opened. On the 8th a gallant sally of French dragoons was gallantly beaten back, and late on the same evening a strong body of infantry, the English foot guards leading the way, stormed, after a bloody conflict, the outworks on the Brussels side. The King in person directed the attack, and his subjects were delighted to learn that, when the fight was hottest, he laid his hand on the shoulder of the Elector of Bavaria and exclaimed, "Look, look at my brave English." Conspicuous in bravery, even among those brave English, was Cutts. In that bulldog courage which flinches from no danger, however terrible, he was unrivalled. There was no difficulty in finding hardy volunteers, German, Dutch and British, to go on a forlorn hope; but Cutts was the only man who appeared to consider such an expedition as a party of pleasure. He was so much at his ease in the hottest fire of the French batteries that his soldiers gave him the honourable nickname of the Salamander. On the 17th the first counterscarp of the town was attacked. The English and Dutch were thrice repulsed with great slaughter, and returned thrice to the charge. At length, in spite of the exertions of the French officers, who fought valiantly sword in hand on the glacis, the assailants remained in possession of the disputed works. While the conflict was raging, William, who was giving his orders under a shower of bullets, saw with surprise and anger, among the officers of his staff, Michael Godfrey, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. This gentleman had come to the King's headquarters in order to make some arrangements for the speedy and safe remittance of money from England to the army in the Netherlands, and was curious to see real war. Such curiosity William could not endure. "Mr. Godfrey," he said, "you ought not to run these hazards. You are not a soldier. You can be of no use to us here." "Sir," answered Godfrey, "I run no more hazard than your Majesty." "Not so," said William. "I am where it is my duty to be, and I may, without presumption, commit my life to God's keeping. But you—" While they were talking, a cannonball from the ramparts laid Godfrey dead at the King's feet. It was not found, however, that the fear of being Godfreyed, such was during some time the cant phrase, sufficed to prevent idle gazers from coming to the trenches. Though William forbade his coachmen, footmen and cooks to expose themselves, he repeatedly saw them skulking near the most dangerous spots, and trying to get a peep at the fighting. He was sometimes, it is said, provoked into horsewhipping them out of the range of the French guns, and the story, whether true or false, is very characteristic. On the 20th of July, the Bavarians and Brandenburgers, under the direction of Cohorn, made themselves masters, after a hard fight, of a line of works which Vauban had cut in the solid rock from the Sambre to the Meuse. 3 days later, the English and Dutch, cuts as usual in the front, lodged themselves on the second counterscarp. All was ready for a general assault, when a white flag was hung out from the ramparts. The effective strength of the garrison was now little more than one half of what it had been when the trenches were opened. Boufflers apprehended that it would be impossible for 8,000 men to defend the whole circuit of the walls much longer, but he felt confident that such a force would be sufficient to keep the stronghold on the summit of the rock. Terms of capitulation were speedily adjusted. A gate was delivered up to the allies. The French were allowed 48 hours to retire into the castle, and were assured that the wounded men whom they left below, about 1,500 in number, should be well treated. On the 6th the allies marched in. The contest for the possession of the town was over, and a second and more terrible contest began for the possession of the citadel. End of section 5.